Dragonslayer isn't a term thrown around very often in the story. This isn't a fairy tale where a heroic knight approaches a massive dragon and takes it out after a long battle. In the A Song of Ice and Fire world, these fire-breathing monsters are so overpowered that every case of a dragon being slain by a man came with a handicap. But most times, their cause of death is from other dragons. They also live so long that passing from natural causes almost never happens. The only time we see a dragon die of old age is Balerion the Black Dread, a dragon that was born sometime in Valyria before the Doom and traveled to Westeros just before the place blew up. Since they continue to grow throughout their lifetime, as long as they are not in captivity, Balerion grew so large that his shadow would cover entire towns when flying overhead. That's over 200 years of non-stop growth for you. So no human would be crazy enough to challenge this beast. Not only would would-be slayers have to look out for the fire breath, which burned hotter than any normal flame, but also teeth as long as sharp swords, along with horns and claws. Even their defense was overpowered. Dragon scales can't be penetrated easily. A brave enough or insane enough challenger will need to find a weak spot. Even with all these traits, 2 instances in the lore mention a character being able to kill a dragon alone with no handicap. But the lore can range from true events to heavily exaggerated to completely fabricated tales, made to tell children or sing in songs. It's all up to the reader to differentiate between the 3. In almost every book in this series, the legendary character Serwyn of the Mirror Shield is brought up. This guy accomplished the impossible in a pretty unique way. We get the full story when Tyrion is being quizzed during the 5th book. How did Serwyn of the Mirror Shield slay the dragon Urax? He approached behind his shield. Urax only saw his own reflection until Serwyn had plunged his spear through his eye. Can you tell me the name of the knight who tried the same ploy with Vhagar during the Dance of the Dragons? Tyrion grinned. Sir Byron Swan. He was roasted for his trouble. Only the dragon was Syrax, not Vhagar. I don't know about you guys, but to me, this hints at the whole Serwyn tale being just that. Let alone the fact that dragons weren't known to be in the Reach, where this man lived, or even Westeros period. There's also more stories about him saving a princess from giants in the Age of Heroes, and being haunted by ghosts. So I think that tells you everything you need to know about the mythical Serwyn. The second character in the lore that may or may not have killed the dragon is Davos the Dragonslayer, who once again lived in the Reach. This is the land of chivalrous knights, which explains all the fairy tales. Davos is only briefly mentioned in the world of Ice and Fire. Nothing about how he did the slaying, which dragon he slayed, or any context at all. Just the name, Davos the Dragonslayer. Fast forwarding thousands of years into the future, we get the next instance of a dragon being hunted by human hands. After the Doom of Valyria, every single dragon lord and their tamed beast were instantaneously wiped off their land. But some Valyrians, like the Targaryens, were off their homeland. Some of the surviving dragon lords were in the Valyrian colonies in Essos at the time of the volcanic cataclysm. But in 102 BC, 400 years before the main story begins, an event called the Century of Blood took place. Some Valyrian dragon lords in Tyrosh and Lys were spared, but that in the immediate political upheaval following the Doom, they and their dragons were killed by the citizens of those free cities. Again, very little context to keep the veil of mystery behind Valyria up. The dragons could have been very young or asleep, who knows? Because in any regular circumstance, it's nearly impossible to kill one, even if an angry mob is charging at one. All it would have to do is take to the air and breathe fire. Unless they had reinforced weapons, like we see 100 years closer to the present. Aegon the Conqueror and his sister wives atop their 3 dragons were able to easily conquer and unite the 7 kingdoms under one king for the first time. Every previous king either died fighting the dragons or bent the knee to avoid an inevitable defeat. Every kingdom except for Dorne. They avoided the dragons by not meeting them on the battlefield at all. The princess of Dorne at the time, Meria Martell, would not fight or bend. Instead, she chose to have assassins try and take out the Targaryens while her fighters hid in the mountains. Aegon's younger sister, Rhaenys, and her dragon Meraxes led the assault on Dorne with no results. For years, they just kept burning castles, and the Dornish would not surrender. And then, in 10 AC, a little less than 300 years before the main story, a sniper using a weapon called a Scorpion was able to shoot down Meraxes with an iron bolt to the eye. Dragon and rider both came crashing down onto the castle below them. Meraxes didn't survive the impact of the fall. I think this is the first true case of a Dragonslayer, not in the traditional sense of a knight with a sword, but still Dragonslayer in my eyes. The weapon used, a scorpion, is the same massive crossbow contraption we see Bronn try and use in the 7th season of Game of Thrones, but he fails where the Dornish marksman succeeded. His name would never be remembered, likely because there were probably a dozen men trying to shoot Meraxes down at the same time. It wouldn't be another 120 years before another Dragonslayer would be born. A Targaryen family civil war was taking place and destroying the 7 kingdoms whenever dragons would meet each other on the battlefield. Countless lives were also lost. When the imminent threat of a dragon attacking the capital, King's Landing, came knocking, the people tried making a run for it, but the city's gates were closed on them. That night, a random older begging man with one hand, only remembered as the shepherd, began preaching to the people that dragons were unnatural demons, and they, along with their riders, should be exterminated. His crowd of desperate civilians kept growing, and he just kept preaching into the morning, until he had more than 10,000 supporters entranced by every word of his crazed rants. As the days went on, the crowd only grew. When the people asked what they should do, he told them the city belonged to dragons. If you want it back, first you need to destroy them. If you would cleanse yourself of sin, first you must bathe in dragon's blood, for only blood can quench the fires of hell. That's all he needed to say to convince 10,000 people to ambush a group of dragons. And by the time they made it to the dragon pit, their numbers had doubled. To quote Fire and Blood once again, seldom have so many men rush eagerly onto their funeral pyres. 4 dragons were being housed in the dragon pit at the time of the assault, and each one woke up angry from being disturbed by all the people pouring in from every door and window. But this situation was the biggest handicap a dragon could face. They were chained up with a dome ceiling above them, preventing them from flying. But they still had their fire. The dragon pit was transformed into a fiery hell. One man, despite all the flames, made it onto the neck of a young dragon called Shrykos. A woodsman known as Hob the Hewer drove his axe down 7 times onto the dragon's head, making him the first Dragonslayer that night. Since many of the shepherd's sheep died that night in the storming of the dragon pit, it's unlikely Hob survived, since he was one of the first inside. The next to be slain was the young dragon, Morgul. A large brute of a man in heavy armor just kamikazed into the dragon's fire with a spear and kept thrusting its point into Morgul's eye over and over as he burned alive. This Dragonslayer is only remembered as the Burning Knight. The third dragon to be slain was Tyraxes, possibly the youngest of all of them in the dragon pit. This little guy wasn't even old enough to take part in the war. Tyraxes constricted itself with its chains when the mob kept coming from different directions, to the point where it could barely move. Half a dozen men and 1 woman would later claim to have dealt the dragon the mortal blow, so no Dragonslayer title here for any character. The last dragon in the pit was over 100 years old, however, and far larger and stronger than her roommates. Dreamfire was able to break free of her chains and take flight. This dragon killed more than the other 3 combined, but eventually the constant bombardment of attacks made Dreamfire fly into the dome above, destroying the place. Dragon and Slayers were crushed beneath all the rubble. With all this chaos happening at this location, another dragon joined in on the fray. The Queen's very own dragon, Syrax. The same one mentioned in Tyrion's quote that killed a would-be Mirror Knight. She wanted in on some of the action. But this massive dragon was free. Screams from the people burning alive could be heard from all over the city, and her flames made it seem like the sun was rising. But for some reason, the dragon decided to land and fight the shepherd's mob on ground. There's no conclusive answer in the books as to who slayed Syrax. It goes from suggesting Hob the Hewer killed 2 dragons, to an archer, then to a spearman, to a knight with a Valyrian steel sword, to finally going into detail of the tale spread the most throughout the city. As others fled, the story went, a one-handed prophet stood fearless and alone against the ravening beast, calling on the 7 for succor. Till the warrior himself took form, 30 feet tall. In his hand was a black blade made of smoke that turned to steel as he swung it, cleaving the head of Syrax from her body. A pretty wild story, but it was likely a combination of attacks from archers, spearmen, and swordsmen to get the job done on the foolish dragon. The civil war would soon come to a conclusion, at the cost of almost every Targaryen dragon alive. Only 4 others survived, but something strange would happen in the coming years. The dragons weren't repopulating properly, eggs were no longer hatching, and the last one born to the family was sickly and stunted. The little thing wouldn't live very long either. The Targaryen king, who came into power in the aftermath of the war, would be remembered as the Dragonbane. since he would be the last sitting Targaryen before they went extinct. For most of his life, he wanted nothing to do with dragons, for all the trauma he was dealt with in the war. As a child, Aegon the Dragonbane's very own dragon was slain while he clung onto its neck. The then prince and very young dragon were escaping capture by pirates by flying off together for the first time, with no saddle, training, or experience. The little dragon Stormcloud would be filled with arrows, and one scorpion bolt to the neck. With a king like this in power, who had such little interest in the family's key to power, it was the perfect time to strike. It's likely that someone was preventing the Targaryens from having more dragons brought into the world and bring more bloodshed. One of the most interesting and mysterious characters in the story, Marwyn the Mage, pretty much confirms this in the 4th book, Feast for Crows. He's an Archmaester of the Citadel with extensive knowledge of higher mysteries, like magic, which makes him an outsider of the elite group. Who do you think killed all the dragons the last time around? Gallant Dragonslayers armed with swords? He spat. The world the Citadel is building has no place in it for sorcery, or prophecy, or glass candles, much less for dragons. Ask yourself why Aemon Targaryen was allowed to waste his life upon the wall, when by rights he should have been raised to Archmaester. His blood was why. He could not be trusted, no more than I. Say nothing of prophecies or dragons, unless you fancy poison in your porridge. The last line came a little later in his speech to Sam, but I think it's important to include because it hints that maesters are capable of acts like poisoning and have their own motives outside of serving like they're supposed to do. The Targaryens and dragons haven't been around very long relative to the 10,000-year history we have of Westeros. Like I said earlier, they only came around 400 years prior on the backs of their beasts. With their landing came the disruption of how things operated on the continent. Magic and magical creatures hold back the progress of man because all the destruction that comes with it. The Maesters, with all their knowledge and superior resources, would not want powerful beings that they can't influence, like they can with common man or lords. So yeah, I believe in Marwyn's words. The Maesters had a hand in the dragon's extinction, with potions and poison, while Aegon the Dragonbane kept a blind eye. What convinced me even further were the deaths of the surviving dragons soon after the war. 2 out of 4 of them were in the Reach afterwards, close to the Citadel. 1 in the exact same city, Old Town. We don't know how the dragons, Silverwing and Morning died, but it's a lot easier to get some poisoning done on your home turf. Those Maesters were Dragonslayers, just not as badass as the others, like Hob the Hewer or the Burning Knight. If you haven't checked out the video I made on the Dragon Keepers, I'll leave a link on your screen that'll take you to it, since it adds to this closely related topic. Those guys were the men defending the dragons from would-be slayers like the Shepherd's Mob. But if you're done with hearing my voice, I'll see y'all another time. Thanks for watching.